you're thinking about selling your home in Alamo Heights, or if your home is already on the market and you're trying to make sense of the response you're getting, one of the most important decisions, often most frustrating decisions you'll face, is how to price it. Really, pricing is one of those things that seems like it should be straightforward at the beginning. You look at recent sales, you consider your home's features, and you arrive at a number that feels reasonable. And for most sellers, that number's not coming really from a place of guessing. It's coming from a place of trying to be thoughtful and informed. But what makes pricing difficult is the market does not respond to intention. It responds to perception, and that's where things can start to feel confusing, because a price that feels justified on paper doesn't always create the response a seller expects once the home is actually on the market. And what I found over time is that most pricing challenges are not the result of one major miscalculation. They're the result of small misalignments between how the home is being positioned and how the buyers are interpreting it in real time. And those misalignments don't always show up immediately. Sometimes they show up as fewer showings than expected. Sometimes as strong interest, but no offers. Sometimes it's feedback that feels inconsistent or difficult to interpret. And when that happens, sellers are left trying to figure out what the issue is. Is it timing? Is it the condition of the home? Is it the price itself? And the reality is that pricing sits at the center of all those factors because it's the lens through which buyers evaluate everything else. So what I want to do is walk you through 7 things to help you understand pricing so you can approach this decision with clarity. And whether you're preparing to list or you're already navigating the process, the first thing you need to understand is that pricing is not about finding the right number. It's about creating the right response, because it's natural to think of a price as a reflection of value. But in practice, price functions more as a signal. It tells buyers how to categorize the home, how it compares to other options, and whether it fits within a range they're already considering. What we consistently see is that when a home is priced in alignment with how buyers are already thinking, it creates immediate clarity. Buyers understand where the home fits, they feel confident scheduling a showing, and they engage with the property more quickly. And that early engagement is what creates momentum. Momentum is what creates leverage, because when multiple buyers are looking at a home at the same time, the dynamic shifts from hesitation to decision-making. But when the price is even slightly outside that alignment, even by an amount that feels small to the sellers, buyers don't necessarily push back directly. What happens is they don't call. They might say the home is overpriced, or they simply hesitate. They wait to see if anything changes, or they move to another home that feels easier to interpret. And that's where pricing becomes less about being correct and more about being understood. Because if a buyer doesn't immediately understand how the home fits into their search, they don't engage. And that leads directly into the second thing you need to understand, which is that buyers are not evaluating your home in isolation. They are comparing it to everything else they've seen. And this is especially important in Alamo Heights, where homes can vary significantly even within the same area. You can have 2 homes with similar square footage that feel completely different based on layout, updates, lot size, and overall presentation. And buyers are consistently making those comparisons, sometimes consciously, sometimes subconsciously, but always consistently. And what that means is your pricing decisions is always being interpreted through a comparative lens. So even if a price feels reasonable based on past sales or personal expectations, if it doesn't align with how your home stacks up against current options, buyers may struggle to justify moving forward. And this is where we often see sellers feeling confused, because they'll say the home is priced in line with what has sold before. But buyers are actually not making decisions based solely on what has sold before. They're making decisions based on what they can choose today. And if something else feels more aligned in price, condition, or overall presentation, that becomes the benchmark, not a past sale. And that's why pricing has to reflect current competition, not just historical data. And that leads directly to the third thing you need to understand, which is the first 2 weeks on the market matter more than sellers expect, because this is when your home receives the highest level of attention. The most active buyers are watching new listings closely. They're often set up on alerts. They're ready to act when something feels like a strong match. And during this window, buyers are not just evaluating whether they like the home. They're really evaluating whether it makes sense relative to everything else they've seen. And when pricing creates clarity and it feels aligned with expectations, you tend to see stronger activity early, more showings, more engagement, and sometimes faster offers. But when there's even a small amount of hesitation, when buyers are unsure how the home compares or whether the price reflects its position in the market, that hesitation slows momentum. And once momentum slows, the perception of the home begins to shift, not dramatically, but subtly, from something new and worth exploring to something that requires more consideration. And over time, that subtle shift can have a meaningful impact on how buyers respond. And that's why pricing at the beginning is not about trying to be aggressive or conservative. It's about being aligned, because alignment is what allows buyers to move forward with confidence instead of uncertainty. And when buyers feel confident, they act more decisively. And that decisiveness is ultimately what drives stronger outcomes, not just in terms of price, but in terms of the overall experience of the process. And once you understand that pricing is about creating the right response, not just arriving at a number, and that buyers are always comparing your home to other options in Alamo Heights, and that the first 2 weeks on the market carry more weight than most sellers expect, the fourth thing you need to understand is that pricing is not static. It's dynamic. And what I mean by that is pricing is not a one-time decision you make before the home goes live. It's something that has to be interpreted in real time based on how the market is responding. And this is where a lot of sellers can feel uncertainty, because they expect feedback to come in clearly, maybe through direct comments or obvious signals. But in reality, the market communicates through behavior, not words. And that means the feedback shows up in patterns. How many showings are happening? How quickly are those showings being scheduled? How long are the buyers staying in the home, and whether they come back for a second look, whether agents are following up with questions, and ultimately whether offers are being written. And when you start to look at all those behaviors collectively, they tell a very clear story about how the home is being perceived at its current price point. And this is especially important for sellers who may already be on the market, because sometimes the home itself is actually not the issue. Sometimes it's the condition. It might be the layout, the location. If they're not all aligned and the home is not positioned relative to price, it is creating just enough hesitation to slow everything down. And that hesitation doesn't always feel dramatic. It can feel subtle, like a steady but limited activity or interest that doesn't quite convert into offers. And those situations, the opportunity is not to overhaul everything, is to interpret what the market is already telling you and make thoughtful adjustments that brings the home back into alignment. And when that alignment is restored, the momentum can return much faster than most sellers expect. And that leads directly to the fifth thing you need to understand, which is small pricing adjustments can have a much larger impact than they appear to on paper. And this is one of the most misunderstood aspects of pricing, because from a seller's perspective, a small adjustment may not feel significant. It may feel like a minor change that shouldn't really dramatically alter the outcome. But from a buyer's perspective, that same adjustment can completely reposition the home. And the reason for that is how buyers search. Well, they don't evaluate every home in the market. They filter. They look within specific ranges, and those ranges shape what they see and how they compare options. So when a home is positioned just outside of a key range, it may not even be considered by a large portion of buyers who would otherwise be interested. And when that same home shifts into a range that feels more aligned, it suddenly becomes part of a different conversation. And it's now being viewed alongside different properties, compared in a different context, and interpreted in a way that feels more consistent with buyer expectations. What's important here is that the home itself hasn't changed. By the way, that shift in categorization can dramatically increase the visibility and the engagement, and ultimately the likelihood of offers. And we actually see this play out in very practical ways. A home that's had a steady but limited activity can suddenly see an increase in showings, stronger feedback, and more serious interest. Not because something was wrong before, but because the adjustment created a better alignment with how buyers are already searching and thinking. And that leads directly into the sixth thing you need to understand, which is that flexibility in pricing is not a sign of weakness. It's a strategic advantage. And what I want to be very intentional with is how I say this, because it is often where conversations can feel sensitive, especially for sellers who are already on the market. But the reality is that the market is always moving. Buyer expectations are always adjusting, and new inventory is always entering the conversation. And that means pricing is not about holding a fixed position. It's about staying aligned within a moving environment. And when sellers approach pricing with flexibility, it allows them to respond to real-time feedback, to refine positioning as needed, and to keep the home competitive as conditions evolve. And that flexibility doesn't mean reacting emotionally or making changes without thought. It means being willing to interpret what's happening objectively and make adjustments that support the overall goal. And in contrast, when pricing becomes fixed or rigid, it can limit the ability to respond to what the market is already communicating. And over time, that can create a situation where the home is no longer being evaluated alongside the most relevant options. And that's where momentum can slow. Not because the home isn't desirable, but because it's no longer positioned in a way that allows buyers to easily engage with it. And this is also where I want to pause and introduce myself more directly, because this is exactly how we approach pricing with our clients. I'm Caroline Decherd with the Park Properties Group at the Phyllis Browning Company, and one of the most important parts of our process is helping sellers interpret the market as it's happening. Not just setting a price and waiting to see what happens, but actively understanding the signals, identifying those signals, what they mean, and making thoughtful, strategic adjustments when needed so that the home stays aligned with buyer expectations. And when you step back and you look at all these 3 points together, pricing is a dynamic process, the impact of small adjustments, and the role of flexibility, you see that pricing is not about defending a number. It's about guiding how the home is experienced in the market. And when the guidance is clear, responsive, and aligned with how buyers are thinking, the process tends to feel much more controlled, much more predictable, and much less stressful overall. And once you understand how pricing creates a response, how buyers are comparing your home to everything else available in Alamo Heights, and how the first 2 weeks shape momentum, and how pricing needs to be interpreted dynamically with flexibility, the seventh and final thing you need to understand is that pricing is ultimately about alignment, not maximization. And this is where everything we've talked about comes together, because it's very natural to approach pricing with the goal of achieving the highest possible number. And that instinct actually makes sense, but the market consistently shows us that the strongest outcomes tend to come from alignment rather than trying to stretch beyond it. And what alignment really means is that the price, condition of the home, the presentation, the expectations of buyers are all working together in a way that feels clear and logical. Because when those elements are aligned, buyers don't have to work to understand the home. They don't have to question how it compares. They don't have to hesitate. They can move forward with confidence. And really, that confidence is what drives stronger engagement, stronger offers, and often a more efficient process overall. And in contrast, when there's even a small gap between these elements, the price feels slightly out of sync with the condition or the presentation or comparison, buyers don't necessarily reject the home, but they slow down, they pause, they wait, and that pause is where momentum begins to shift. And what's important to understand is this is not a reflection of the home itself. It's simply a reflection of how the home is being interpreted in the context of the market at that moment. And this is especially relevant for sellers who have maybe already listed and wondering why the response hasn't been what they expected. Because in many of those situations, the issue is not something has gone wrong. It's that something is slightly out of alignment. And when that alignment is restored, activity can change very quickly. And we see this happen often, where home that felt like it had slowed down begins to see renewed interest with more consistent showings and stronger engagement once the pricing better reflects how buyers are already evaluating it. And again, this is not about being right or wrong. It's about understanding, because the market rewards clarity, and pricing is one of the most important tools for creating that clarity. And when you step back and you look at all these 7 points together, you can start to see a very consistent pattern. First, pricing is about creating a response, not just choosing a number. Second, buyers are always comparing your home to other options. Third, the first 2 weeks on the market are critical for momentum. Fourth, pricing is dynamic and must be interpreted in real time. Fifth, small adjustments can create meaningful shifts in perception. Sixth, flexibility allows you to stay aligned as the market evolves. And now seventh, alignment, not maximization. is what ultimately drives the strongest outcome. And when these 7 ideas work together, the entire process feels different. Instead of feeling like you're trying to test the market or wait for the right buyer, it feels like you're guiding the home into a position where buyers can respond clearly and confidently. And that's where you start to see better results, not just in terms of price, but in terms of timing, consistency, and overall experience. This is also where I want to bring everything back into a practical next step. Because if you're watching this and you're thinking about selling, whether it's in the next few months or even later this year, the most valuable thing you can do right now is not try to guess the perfect price, is to start understanding how your home fits into the current market, how buyers are likely to interpret it, and what positioning strategy would create the clearest response. And that's something that becomes much easier when you give yourself time. Because when you start 3 to 6 months before going on the market, you have the ability to evaluate your home objectively, to compare it to current and recent sales in a meaningful way, and to build a strategy that aligns with both your goals and the way buyers are thinking. And for sellers who may already be on the market, this is also an opportunity to step back and look at the process through a slightly different lens. Not asking whether something has gone wrong, but asking whether the current positioning is creating the level of clarity needed for buyers to move forward. And sometimes that perspective alone is enough to identify what needs to shift. And when those adjustments are made thoughtfully, the process can regain momentum much more quickly than expected. This is exactly how we approach our pricing with our clients. I'm Caroline Decherd with the Park Properties Group at the Phyllis Branding Company. Our goal is to help you understand not just where your home sits in the market, but how to position it in a way that creates the strongest possible response, whether that involves setting the initial strategy before going live or refining that strategy based on how the market is reacting. Because pricing is not a one-time decision. It's an ongoing conversation with the market. And when you approach it in that way, it becomes much more manageable and much more effective. And if you're considering selling in the next 3 to 6 months, or if you're currently on the market and want a clear understanding of how your home is being positioned, the best next step is to start that conversation early, to review your home, your goals, your timing in a way that allows you to move forward with clarity instead of uncertainty, because it's never too early to start planning. And when you start early, you give yourself the advantage of making decisions with confidence instead of reacting under pressure. And that's ultimately what leads to a better experience, a stronger result when it matters most. Have a great day.